I have deep concerns about putting somebody like RFK Jr. in charge of something that requires a completely objective analysis of data.
Welcome back to The Unknowns. I'm your host, Charlie Stone, and today we have Dr. Francis Collins, who's not only a renowned physician and scientist, he actually discovered some of the genes involved in the Human Genome Project, serving as the director of the National Institutes of Health over many presidents, both Republican and Democrat. He also likes the guitar, and I think he owns a motorcycle. Is that correct, sir?
Those are all true, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think it's interesting because you are a renowned scientist, right, and a physician. You have been appointed by former President Obama, former President Trump, and also President Biden. So politics isn't involved in that, right? They at least those three presidents looked at you and said, check. When you enter into a new administration, is it a little bit different, or are you still focused on the science?
The primary focus has to be the science. I had this privilege of leading the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. Many of the breakthroughs that have happened in human health over the last few decades have been because of NIH, and it has blessedly been pretty much kept out of the political battles. But more and more, as those battles get more intense and people get more hyper-partisan aligned, even medical research occasionally gets dragged into it. And it sort of did during COVID in ways that were unfortunate.
Well, we do have a situation here where someone like RFK may be involved. He has positions that maybe not all scientists agree with. Do you have concerns there?
I have deep concerns about putting somebody like RFK Jr. in charge of something that requires a completely objective analysis of data. He's not shown his ability to do that over many years, where he selectively picks things that seem to cast doubt on such things as vaccines and makes that the story. And he has contributed to, I think, an expanded sense of doubt and cynicism about vaccines in the American public at a time that we really can't afford that, especially when it comes to children's vaccines, but also for things like COVID. And God help us if we have another pandemic, maybe the next one will be influenza, and we need a vaccine. We maybe even need to do things like putting on masks again. With all of the ways in which that has been politicized, we're going to have a very hard time convincing the public that public health really does have messages we need to listen to.
As you reflect, obviously, you were director during COVID, a once-in-a-generational sort of experience. We all are sort of still PTSD from it. Well, upon reflection, are there things, and this is all hindsight, right, but are there things that could have been done differently? Certainly there were people who were more at risk from dying of COVID, but it seems like we all locked down. Is that in reflection, is that sort of like, should we have handled that differently, or we just didn't know at that point?
What you said at the end there is really important. We were trying to figure out how to handle an unknown enemy while we were learning about it day by day, and oftentimes didn't have nearly enough information to be sure what to expect. We should have done a better job. And I'll say that's true for me, because I was one of those people talking frequently to the public about this, of explaining that this was very much a moving target, that we were going to try to put forward the best recommendations we could for what we knew at that point, but they might turn out later to be wrong, and we would need to revise them, and people shouldn't be surprised. I think the lockdowns at the early parts of this in March or April of 2020 were reflecting of the fact that we saw people dying in droves, especially in the cities. But I also think that in rural communities where there hadn't been a whole lot of disease yet, those lockdowns seemed extreme. And in retrospect, if we'd had the time to sort of stop and try to individualize the approach across the country, and if we'd had the staff to do that, if we hadn't decimated the public health system in local communities in the previous years, then it would have been much better to try to do something that was more optimized for each community. People began to wonder, are these people who are telling us what to do based on what CDC has concluded, is that really about us? And how come they changed the recommendation a month later, do they really know what they're talking about? Are they just jerking us around? And we lost the confidence of more than 50 million Americans who then, when something really important came along, like a vaccine that had been shown in rigorous double-blind randomized controlled trials to be highly effective and safe, they said, no, thank you.
Does President Trump, get some credit for that, for advancing those and taking down barriers, bureaucracy, whatever, to ensure that the vaccines rolled out?
Absolutely. This phenomenal effort called Operation Warp Speed, supported by Trump, but really the brains behind that came from his secretary, Alex Azar of Health and Human Services, who had experience in pharma, so he knew something about how you get stuff done. And that was organized in a way that brought together the Department of Defense and Health and Human Services, and a whole bunch of us who were working 100-hour weeks to make sure that nothing got in the way of the development and the testing and the plans for distribution of those vaccines. And Trump could have taken a lot of credit for that. For various reasons, he seemed not to be excited about doing so. And I think things could have been different if he'd wrapped his arms around it and kept it in part of his own presentation. As this was a success story, because it was amazing what got done.
So just going back to the Trump administration and its handling of COVID, from your perspective, letter grade from A to F, how did they do?
Boy, it's awful hard to put just one letter grade. They did fantastic in terms of Operation Warp Speed in putting in place the most amazing campaign to develop vaccines the world had ever seen, and succeeding in a way that had never happened before. In terms of the public communication, it was pretty uneven, and the president himself was often out of sync with what his own CDC was saying, and that confused people further. So it was a mixed bag.
What lessons have we learned, and which lessons would you like to be applied the next time?
Charlie, this is what I'm really worried about, that in the face of this circumstance where an enemy should have brought us together, isn't that what's supposed to happen? You have somewhat of a polarized, divisive society, and there's a need to bring them together, and you say, well, if we just had a common enemy. We had one. It was called the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. And what did it do? It further drove us. Our society is in a very sick space right now. I just published a book called The Road to Wisdom. It's my reflection on this from a scientist's perspective and also a person of faith. What happened to us? We've lost our anchors. One of the anchors we've lost is whether there's such a thing as objective truth. And if so, how do you find it and trust it? And how do you trust science to give you answers that you can believe in and not just discount because you don't like the conclusion? Now, out of people of faith who ought to be out there in front of bringing us back together again, as people who are supposed to love our neighbors, even love our enemies, how did they get so pulled into political messages that the church oftentimes seems even more broken apart than the rest? We're in a very strange, odd place. I think there are ways to find our way out of this, but I don't think they're going to come from the politicians or the media.
You had mentioned your journey of faith. I found that fascinating. I'd just like to explore it a little bit. But I think in graduate school, you were agnostic, and then you kind of moved, and I think you self-admitted a serious Christian. From someone who is interested in the objective, how does one find resonance in the faith, which doesn't always have objective facts to it?
Well, exactly. And when I was a graduate student studying chemistry, I was not just an agnostic, I was an atheist. But then I went to medical school and found myself faced with suffering and death that I'd never really had such close exposure to. And it did shake me up a little bit when I watched what people were doing to respond to that and wondered what I would do. And one of my patients kind of confronted me one afternoon after she had shared her faith with me and asked me, well, doctor, what do you believe? And I realized I had never done a serious study of that question, and that's probably a bad thing. So I undertook kind of a 2-year journey to try to understand, why would rational people believe in God? Because I assumed there could be no reason for that. And to my surprise, discovered there are all kind of pointers to a creator God in science, like the fact that there was a big bang and there's something instead of nothing, and matter and energy follow these beautiful mathematical laws. What is that about? And I also began to realize that there was pointers to the fact that there might be something more personal about this God, not just a deist kind of view. And particularly the fact that we all have this sense of morality that I couldn't fully explain on a absolutely evolutionary, materialistic basis. And then I found, as I searched through world religions, that they had a lot to offer, but there was one that stood out particularly because of the character of Jesus, as somebody who not only claimed to know God, but to be God. That was outrageous. And to forgive sins, that's really outrageous. But then he died. He died on a cross, and by eyewitnesses rose from the dead. Now that's tough stuff for a scientist. It took me 2 years kicking and screaming, and ultimately, as a somewhat reluctant convert, I became a Christian at age 27. And I've never found that to present conflicts with what I know as a scientist. I mean, they ask different questions. Science asks questions that often start with how. How does that work? Faith lets you ask questions that start with why. Why am I here? And I thought those were interesting questions too. And to be purely devoted to science, which you could call scientism, began to feel sort of impoverished, like you're leaving out a lot of the things that really matter. And I wanted not to leave those in. So here I am.